Well, hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, whatever it is for you, wherever you are. I am Dr. Hess. I am your instructor for this class. This is Abnormal Psych at PCC, Psych 239. In this class, we'll be covering a lot of the psychological disorders. We'll be talking about today we'll be talking about what is abnormal behavior. We'll talk a little bit about and try to define what normal behavior is. We'll be covering chapter 1 this week. Welcome to the class, by the way. And if you have any questions, make sure that you reach out to me via email. Since this class is online and there's no synchronous times for us to be together for a lecture, I put together some of these little videos so that you can hear a little bit from me about what I think is important in the chapters as we go along. So let me start our PowerPoint as we go along here, and we will share this with this, and we will start our slideshow. And here we are, chapter 1. Here's our textbook. Hopefully you've had it by now and have a chance to read the chapter 1 for us. It's always probably a little bit better before you watch the video that at least you skim through it and take a look at what we have here in the textbook. Let me grab my spotlighter tool. Here we go. Here's some of our learning objectives for chapter 1. We'll talk a little bit about the meaning of abnormality. We'll be talking a little bit about the ancient aspects of psychology and how some of our forefathers and foremothers thought about psychology and psychological disorders. We'll be talking a couple of models, mainly the behavioral and psychoanalytic models of abnormality. And we'll end up talking about the biosocial, psychosocial model, which includes probably the most modern aspects of abnormal psychology. As I mentioned before, it's kind of difficult to describe what normal is these days. And it's probably a little bit harder to say what is abnormal. It's really not so clear-cut anymore. But abnormal in our textbook is defined as something that's away from normal. Being away from normal assumes that there's some kind of deviation from the average of what we're talking about. And we're talking about normal being normal for our culture, normal for our family, normal for our group, or normal for us. I suggest you don't get too hung up on this normal, abnormal bit. We'll be talking about some of the aspects of the next couple slides of kind of hopefully that will kind of tease out some of the differences when we're talking psychologically about abnormal psychology. Something about abnormal is that being different doesn't always necessarily bad. Sometimes being different is good. Some people who are maybe really tall might be better at basketball. Some people who have really good voices would be wonderful singers. So necessarily being abnormal or different isn't necessarily a negative, and it can be. And when we're studying the medical model of psychology, often it is a negative for us. It's something that we're trying to treat and help alleviate the symptoms of the people that are experiencing it. Deviance is basically behaving different. We're talking about the D's of abnormality. Deviance is the first D. Difference was deviance was second. Difference was first, deviance was second, sorry. Deviant behaviors are kind of different from our societal norms. Most people in our group would say, oh, that's not the way we act, and it doesn't quite fit. It's important to take a look at the context of our group. We all act differently in different areas. So we act differently maybe at work than we would at school, that we would in our families or at our grandmother's house. And so context is important when we're looking at this. We also want to make sure that we're also taking in consideration the maturity or the developmental stages of the people that we're talking about. we wouldn't expect the normal behavior of a 2-year-old to be what we would see in, say, a 26-year-old. We expect them to act differently. So context as far as development is kind of important too. One of the D's then in this abnormality definition is the dangerous behavior. And it's important to note that most people who are suffering from psychological disorders are not dangerous to themselves or others. But there is a minority that is, and those people oftentimes need to be have treatment or need to be hospitalized in order to make sure that they don't hurt others or themselves. Dysfunction is another way of looking at abnormality. This is where we aren't able to do our daily tasks, get up, go to school, go to work, do whatever we want to do, have our relationships. We are not functioning in the way that we could, maybe emotionally. Our emotions are not being managed the way they should. And this can lead to distress in the individual and also in the people around us. When we're talking about disorders, we're talking about the disorders that are in this book, the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. In here are hundreds of disorders and their definitions, along with symptom lists and demographic information about each one of them. And in here you will find definitions of depression, major depression, bipolar depression, anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, you name it. They're all in here, and they all are considered to be, this is the book that's considered to be important in America, in the United States, for defining, so clinicians, counselors, doctors can all talk about depression, knowing that we're talking about the definitions and in this book. The DSM-5, this book, is also, a lot of this book is online, so you can look it up and you don't have to buy it. You can read a lot of it online. Just Google DSM-5 and you'll be able to pick it up. Uses a categorical approach. In other words, they put together all of the anxiety disorders, all of the mood disorders, all of the disorders that started in childhood. And they also use a dimensional approach. In other words, from like mild dysfunction to severely dysfunctional, all along the same category of whatever we're talking about, anxiety or depression. This is a quick little chart to show when most people will be diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder. And you can see any disorder here, just to group them all. The blue thing is that most people will be diagnosed between the ages of 30 and 44. But again, as you see, they're really closely together. A lot of this is going to happen between the ages of 18 and 59. We also have to take into some personal characteristics such as sex, race, and ethnicity. Also socioeconomic status when we're looking at abnormal behavior. These are all important. Also, if we start talking about the biological aspects of psychology, the genetic predispositions that some of us carry from the genes that we received from our parents might put us on a pathway to being prone to certain disorders. So if we want to talk a little bit about the history about how ancient societies thought about ancient psychology or abnormal behavior, we'll talk about way back in the caveman times. We would the shaman and women, the medicine men and women of our tribe would try to treat people who weren't acting normal according to our culture. And they would do such treatments here as trephination, which is drilling a little hole in the top of their head. This picture here has 3 holes, 3 treatments that were done on this. They were trying to allow the evil spirits out of the head of the person who was had this disorder or is not acting normally. And it seems a little primitive, but actually they were onto something here because they recognized that the problem was here in the brain. And this is something we know now in our present day, that a lot of our psychological problems start right here in the brain. So it's kind of good when you think back on it that they were onto this. And also, it's important to note that we still do psychosurgeries where we are drilling into people's brains and doing microsurgeries on certain parts of their brain to help them with psychological disorders. As we're coming closer to our time in life, we have Hippocrates, which is the father of medicine. He started writing down some symptom lists, some ideas about some psychological disorders such as delusions and mania, and started just talking about and coined the term hysteria. He was the first person to start doing this. During the Renaissance and the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church was pretty much running the world as it was at that point. And we were back to thinking that somehow it was this abnormal psychological behavior was somehow involved with devils or demons and witchcraft at this point. And so the treatment of the day was some kind of exorcism where we were trying to drive the devil out of people so that they would act normal again. As we get closer to our time, we have more and more people trying to help people with disorders. We would set up kind of houses at the end of the street, large houses where we would call them asylums, where we'd send people that couldn't really make it in the world, couldn't work, couldn't maybe harm themselves or others. So we kept them away from the people in the town. But we were trying to treat them with using all kinds of different treatments, whatever we could at that point. As we come even closer, we get closer to the 20th century, Sigmund Freud comes on the scene, and he shows the importance of concepts that he writes about as far as the unconscious, the ego, the id, and the superego. He talks about defense mechanisms, such as rationalization, such as regression, sublimation. And he starts to talk about psychological and psychiatric disorders as a medical problem. And his theory revolves around sexual urges and the psychosocial development of individuals. He came up with a scheme or stages of psychosocial development that he says that we all go through. If we have a problem in one of those stages, we are fixated, as he said, in this time, and this is where we would become neurotic and suffer from psychological disorders. About the same time, or a little bit afterwards, behaviorists came on the scene. Pavlov and Watson, they did a lot of work on this, and basically they are not interested in your sexuality or any unconscious conflicts. They are not interested in any whys or why you do anything. They are more interested in what you're doing, the behavior that you are exhibiting, and studying that. They believe here that behavior is learned and therefore can be unlearned. And so behaviorist theory, which is probably one of the most popular, cognitive behavioral therapy is probably the most popular therapy in counseling today. And basically the whole object is to unlearn this dysfunctional behavior that you have learned so that you can have something that's more appropriate for you and your life to get you back on thing. Our textbook kind of looks at the view of abnormal behavior as a scientist practitioner model. This is where we were providing treatment that relies on kind of evidence-based research. In other words, research that shows that this treatment works. Say if someone has depression, if we do this particular talk therapy with them, or we provide this particular medication for them, we have evidence in the research that has been published to say that, yes, this helps people. And that's what that scientist practitioner thing. It's important to note that the biological models that we're looking at in this book, we always have to make sure that we're taking a look at the brain and its messenger systems, specifically the neurons, the synapses, and the neurotransmitters. Because if we have a dysfunction or an overfunction of this communication within the brain, we can have psychological problems. An example of this is people who suffer from low serotonin levels will be depressed. So we will can give them medications that increases the serotonin level in their brains, causing them to maybe have more energy, maybe have raise their spirits a little bit and be able to get back on track. There are lots of ways that our brains can be damaged, and in some ways it is miraculous that our brains function as well as they do for as long as they do, because there's any kind of stroke or kind of viral diseases or kind of bacterial diseases that can attack our brains, can leave us with psychological disorders or things that look like psychological disorders. Our brain functions really well, but if they get a little bit off due to some kind of biological or physical damage, we can have different problems. We also need to talk about genetics, behavioral genetics. Sometimes we look at things called epigenetics, where the environment is impacting our genes and causing them to express them in certain ways. Here's a quick picture of a couple of neurons talking to each other with a basic structure, and the communication is happening here between this. These are the neurotransmitters, these little purple dots going from one neuron to the next through the synapses. This communication is what allows us to think, allows us to have emotion, allows us to have our memories, allows us to move, allows us to do pretty much everything. Neurons are so important for human life. So the modern psychoanalytic models, so this is post-Freudian, they're kind of Jungian, Adler are a few of these people that are looking at different ways, less of a concentration on the sexual stages of human beings, but more on some spiritual aspects for Jung, and some kind of more social aspects in Adler that help us function in the world or not function in the world. The behavioral model basically is, as I noted earlier, an important one because most counselors are using cognitive behavioral therapy, a mixture of working with the brain and the behavior at the same time. We do this through shaping, and shaping is basically a process that we slowly in small steps get to where we want the behavior, the goal of the behavior to be. The cognitive model is basically looking at and asking questions of clients and patients that whenever there's some kind of distorted cognitive or mental processes happening where what we're thinking doesn't necessarily match with reality. Aaron Beck was important in this. He talks about a lot of different negative thoughts that people have, thoughts of a negative view of ourselves, a negative view of the world, or negative view of the future, leaving us either depressed or anxious a lot of the times. Because of the way we look at the future. The humanistic model is brought to us by Carl Rogers, and he pretty much says that pretty much everyone has what they need within them to grow, And he developed client-centered therapy, where he said that if we provide a empathetic, uh, safe place for people to talk about what's going on with them, they'll be able to grow and solve their own problems. Our textbook puts an emphasis on the biopsychosocial perspective, and this is probably one of the best ways of looking at abnormal psychology. We want to look at the bio part, which is our bodies, our brains. We want to look at the psychological part, which we could look and say maybe what our minds are doing, our self-talk, and our social interactions. So all three of those combine into a perspective where we can take a look at the abnormal disorders, abnormal psychology disorders, in a way. The diathesis model is represented here in this figure 1.6 in our textbook. It either allows for some kind of biological or psychological vulnerability within us, causing distress or dysfunction in our lives, leading us to have a psychological disorder, which will probably need treatment. Or stress or environmental factors will lead to distress and dysfunction, leading to a psychological disorder. And we can have both. We can have stress and also a biological or genetic predisposition to a psychological disorder. This brings us to the end of chapter 1. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here and for joining us in our class. Again, if you have any questions, please reach out and email with me, and continue doing our homework on the through our through our content in our D2L class. As I always say, keep being curious. Bye for now.